Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Seek and Find podcast. Over the last several weeks, hopefully you've been listening to Season 1 and our recap of Season 1 of The Chosen. I have two of the same guests that you've been hearing from a lot, Mrs. Hensley and Mr. Zengel, but we have a new guest today joining us for at least a little bit of this, and that is Mr. Jacob Hensley. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Adam, happy to be here.
We're excited to have you just to hear from a non-teacher's perspective. We've been referring back to the teacher's perspectives a lot, which there's nothing wrong with because, you know, this is for high school kids and beyond. But it'll be cool to hear from a different voice. So we are jumping into Season 2 today, and without, wasting too much time, I say we just jump right into Episode 1, which is titled Thunder. So before we... I guess start talking about Season 2, we should talk real quickly about how Season 1 ended. So Season 1 ended with the episode with the woman at the well, and it was significant because Jesus, for the first time, is beginning to allow people to tell others that he's the Messiah. And so Season 1 ends with a cool celebration walk-off from the apostles with the awesome song at the end celebrating this moment. There's an awesome picture. I think you might have had it in your posters that you brought last time with.
Yeah, where's the book?
I don't have Season 2 poster book.
Simon's hugging Jesus, and they're just laughing. It's just a cool moment right at the end of the first season. So Season 2 begins right at the beginning. This episode starts with an opening montage of the apostles, and they're older, and they're giving their account of Jesus, and John is writing down this testimony. And I love that we get to see, particularly Matthew and John, and how they're documenting this, because we sort of just read the Gospels and we don't often think about from the writer's perspective, even though we know John and Matthew wrote Gospels. It's just cool to see how they organize their thoughts. So it's a cool opening montage to this. I think I'll just summarize the whole episode real quick, and then we'll just jump into everything. So Season 2 begins with that montage, but then we get back to the present time, and you notice let me summarize a couple other things real quick about that montage. So we notice that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is giving her testimony, but in that process you notice that John refers to her as mother, which is a reference back to Scripture when Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother." Then we also have reference that James, John's older brother, has been killed at this point.
Correct.
And John is in a hurry to gather this information because he's like, who knows how much time we all have?
Who else is going to die?
Yeah. One of the things that Mary says to him that stood out to me was that, if you tried to write everything down that he did, the world itself could not contain the books that would be written.
Love that.
I thought that was awesome. And John calls it a disclaimer.
Yeah.
That's a cool disclaimer. We can't get everything in
Which
here.
makes him a little bit more like Matthew when he says that. That's almost
true.
like something Matthew would have said, "Oh, I need to take note of this."
Yeah.
That's a good
It
point.
might not make it in, but you need to write that note down.
Absolutely. It's a good point. So John has talked to her about starting the gospel at the beginning, but he doesn't know which beginning to start with. And so that's kind of a theme of the whole episode, honestly, is what is the beginning? Is it the beginning of time? Is it the beginning of Jesus? Is it Jesus' birth? And so that's a little bit of the theme. So when they go back to present day, Big James and John are tilling up this field, and they're sowing some crops. And they're discussing why Jesus put them to work. And as they're talking, you can hear how they're just sort of making it all about them.
Yeah.
Look how good we are. Jesus chose us because we're strong.
Because we're strong. We make straight rows.
Absolutely. So they're doing that. You have Thomas and Rama for the first time are entering the story. So Thomas, more famously known as Doubting Thomas from Scripture, enter the story, and they're in the process of trying to meet Jesus. We met him in Season 1 at the wedding feast at Cana, and Jesus invited them to join them later. So they're discussing things with Rama's father, and Rama's father clearly disapproves of what they're doing, but he agrees because he wants to thank Jesus for helping his business.
His reputation.
Yeah. So while we're jumping around to a lot of stories here, but I'm trying to just encapsulate it all so we can dive into it. So then the rest of the gang is preparing the city of Sychar for the sermon from Jesus that's about to come. So they realize at this point they can't find Jesus, and it turns into some more bickering amongst Matthew and Simon and Andrew, and Mary's there. She's not one who tends to bicker, but they're trying to figure out where Jesus is. They realize later that he is not lost, of course, because he's Jesus, and he was preaching a sermon in the middle when they found him anyways. We're introduced to the character of Melech as well, who notices his field has been sown. James and John don't know who they sowed the field for, but this is who it was sowed for, and he is handicapped with a broken leg, and we'll dive into his story in a moment, I'm sure, as well. Towards the end of the episode, we have, we'll talk about Melech's story in a moment, but then what really the whole episode is called Thunder for a reason is because we have a moment where James and John act wrongly in hate and anger towards Samaritans particularly. So that's another thing you have. You have the apostles fighting back against helping people that are not Jewish. So we've got those kind of like, I guess, three groups of people is how I break it down. And you got James and John's story, you got the apostles as a whole and how they bicker with one another, and you've got Melech's story that I think we can focus on and how ever we want to dive into all three of those things. It's hard to summarize this episode because it's over an hour long, and I have a page and a half of notes on this episode. So I don't care. Let's just turn it loose. Whoever wants to dive in on something that they love the most, just dive into it. I can cut out silence, so it's not a big deal. Don't feel like you have to speak.
I had the seek and you will find in here. Did you catch that?
I'm sure I have a note on that in here.
Yeah.
Yes, here it is. When it's at a moment where they're trying to figure out what to do next, and you have all the apostles who are like, Jesus goes and prays. He just needs to be away from them.
He
and
doesn't always tell them he's leaving. He just
correct.
says, screw you guys.
They're like, where are you going? He goes, I need some time to pray or to myself. And somebody asks, well, how do we know where to find you? Seek and you will find.
Right.
And he walks away. But that leads to a moment where I said it in one of the episodes last time. I like when we see the apostles arguing. It's not that I like disagreement and I like when they don't like each other, but they're acting like real people, and we assume the 12 apostles were united all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They had to argue.
Yeah, they were all so different from different backgrounds. I mean, a couple of them are similar, but I mean, it's no wonder
If they got along, John and Matthew wouldn't have written their own gospel.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Oh, that is a good point. Good job,
I
Doc.
felt like I was constantly writing that in my notes, like throughout the entire season. Oh, the crew was disagreeing again.
Yeah.
They were disagreeing again. Like, it's a really neat perspective to see, because they are human, and like you said, they're from different backgrounds. So, never really thought about that before. But yeah,
like
it's
a
a
family.
constant.
You also get the deep, generational hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans, particularly James and John.
Right.
When they find out that they cultivated a field for a Samaritan,
Yeah.
they aren't very happy about it, and they're telling this to Jesus.
Right.
So there's just this deep generational hatred amongst groups, which has been in society forever, for eternity, and that's what the whole point of Jesus was, to try to break those barriers. Yes, to stir the waters a little bit, but to break the barriers and realize that the chosen people aren't just the Jewish people anymore. It's everyone, which is cool.
I also thought a cool scene was when Jesus was helping someone fix their cart when he was
Yeah.
missing.
I wrote that down too.
Because later in this, I don't know if it's episode 7 or 8. Oh, it must be 8 when he's talking to Matthew and he's writing the Beatitudes. He tells him, this is a map. This is where you're going to find me in these people. And I was like, man, driving down the road, people helping someone else fix their tire. That's Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I have done it before, but I know I've passed up the opportunity way more times than I've actually helped. But every time I pass up the opportunity, I kind of feel guilty. I'm like, oh, I should have helped that person, right? But now I'm like, man, that's Christ.
I have that.
That's what I'm supposed to see.
100%. I think, excuse me, I think I have a similar feeling anytime I pass anybody that's in need.
Yeah.
Like, even recently at our local Kroger, there's been a couple of people hanging out right at the end of the street there.
Yeah.
And I'm like, do I stop and try to talk to them?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm by myself, I'm more apt to do that. Like, if I have my kids with me, I just get a little nervous. You never know what the heck would happen. If I'm just talking to the person, what's wrong? But then the impatient society we live in, like,
Yeah.
I even slowed down one time, and people behind me are beeping. I'm like, all right, I'll get moving. Like, I was going to just talk to the guy and see, what his story was.
Right.
Or to see if he was a scam artist, because unfortunately people are scam artists.
Yeah.
So I just think it's so easy to pass up opportunities to just do what's right instead of like I just did. I just talked myself out of it because people around me were talking me out of it instead of just doing what I thought was the right thing to do.
And to piggyback off of that, one thing that I liked in this episode was Jesus as a human example. So there were two specific times where he mentioned, like, let's sleep on it, like, think about it.
Yeah.
And one was when Caphne wanted to talk to him, giving
Yeah.
Rama over, and Thomas. He said, how about we sleep on this and talk about it in the morning? He knew, like, both of their human limitations, that it was a long day, they were exhausted, they were going to be more refreshed when they came back the next day. He said the same thing to Melek when he was saying, hey, why don't you follow me, after he was talking to him that night? Why don't you sleep on it? Let's talk about it tomorrow. And, of course, we all know what happens after he woke up the next day.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about the story of Melek, because even though the Sons of Thunder moment was a powerful part, like, the serious part was when Melek was telling his story.
Right.
Because he can't figure out why in the world Jesus is helping him. Eventually, Jesus gives him that answer, and it goes back to what sermon the apostles heard when they found him. They were hearing him talk to the people about the lost sheep.
Right.
And he tells Melek, the shepherd leaves the 99 to find the one who is lost. And so, Don, I'm going to you tend to, recite these stories a little better than I do. Why don't you tell us Melek's story and what was going on there?
Melek is, according to Melek's story, he and a buddy who were both on hard times. He makes it appear at first that his buddy talked him into it, which probably all of us would have done the same, but who knows. They turn to something illegal to get themselves out of debt, or to save their families, or to feed their families, or to make themselves feel good. We don't really know, but they are the two bad guys in the story of the man walking to Jericho, from Jerusalem to Jericho, who gets beaten and everything stolen and is laying naked until the Good Samaritans comes along. But of course, in Melek's mind, he is remorseful now. He has been punished by God in his own right. At least that's what he's thinking. When he's thrown from the horse and has broken his leg, he can no longer work. He has no food for his daughter and his wife. And he comes to the conclusion that the person that they attacked has to be dead. So he feels personally as if God has punished him, could not love him, and that he is not deserving of that love. Which is a beautiful story, because when else have we ever heard what happens to these people, any of those people in that story? We don't even know what happens to the good guy and the guy who gets healed.
Right.
And now the only one we hear this from, I'm not giving Dallas Jenkins credit, whoever came up with this, is amazing in bringing this all together. With the lost sheep.
Yeah.
Perfect gospel or perfect passage to bring this back to.
It was. In the midst of that conversation between Melek and Jesus, there was a great quote from Jesus, too, because everyone that was waiting for the Messiah assumed that was the moment when pain and suffering would stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus shares with Melek's family that in this world, bones are still going to break and hearts are still going to break. But he's still asking them to trust him in the long run, that in the end, they'll be saved. In the end, there's still hope, which is cool.
I also think there's a weird play on words. The gospel is the lost sheep, but Melek makes a point that he ran. So it's almost like we're drawing conclusion to those people who are lost. Sometimes they're not lost. They have turned their back and run away.
Intentionally.
That's different.
That's probably more often the
But
case.
probably more often, right? So when I always thought of that story, the lost sheep, I never imagined that the sheep left the group on purpose. I always imagined it was like one of our students. Right? So that one kid in the back of the line, hey, what's this? Oh, where'd everybody go? That kid.
Right.
Right? But maybe it's not that kid. Maybe it's the kid that says, I'm tired of them. I'm going down this hallway. I know I shouldn't.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it just kind of brought it back to this whole who's lost, who's really lost.
Which makes it even more impressive that
Yeah.
God would leave the 99 to go find you when you chose to.
Right? I
walk away.
would go find the little 6th grader who I know is still can't figure out the hallways. I would go find that kid way faster than I would go find the 8th grader
Yeah.
who I know is avoiding my class.
Somehow I'd love to make this a theme in school, like to encourage the kids who are following rules to seek the lost sheep more.
Yeah.
I don't know how we do. I mean, we talk about it. We talk about being kind. We talk about,
Being a good example.
being a good example and welcoming people. But to like really figure out how to cultivate that. I mean, if we had the secret to that, I guess we could solve society's problems. But
Well, it's building leaders at that point, right? You're
Right.
not just building followers.
that's a good point.
You're teaching them to turn around and pass it on.
Great point. And that's another secret that's hard to do, cultivating leadership, because we don't have great examples of
No.
it. We really don't.
What are you talking about? We don't have examples of that.
Not all the time.
Oh.
I'm wearing a shirt that has a bunch of saints on it, so maybe they can be good examples for us. But one of the things I just heard in a video I was watching a Bible study thing on Genesis, and he was talking about Abraham and some of the figures that we see and how we assume, like when Jesus said he was going to, I'm going off topic here, but when Jesus was going to give these guys a great name, like in modern thought, that means celebrity status, that means well-known, that means popular,
yeah.
but that doesn't mean that. He means great in the sense of being holy and being saintly. And I think that's how you've got to cultivate the mindset. I'm not going to make you famous. I'm not going to make you known by everybody. I'm just going to make you make others better. I'm going to help you.
Make you Christ-like.
Yes. Thank you. That's a word that would have been better to use.
Make you change tires.
Yeah. Fix the axle.
No
Yeah.
longer wheels.
With,
Well, I guess
he said, just
Put some
put some pitch on
pitch
it.
on it. You have any pitch?
I don't even know what that is. Mud, something or another to hold it together. Who knows? So the last part of the story here is with Big James and John. And so in the midst, when Jesus leaves the table, tells them to seek and you'll find me, they start taking a vote on what should be done next. And you can tell there's a little bit of a power struggle. Like Simon has sort of self-proclaimed himself as leader in a way. James and John disagree with whatever Simon had said. And so they eventually lead to take a vote. Some people abstain. Some people are for Simon and Peter. And James and John essentially just get upset and leave. And so like, you know what? We're going to go ask Jesus ourselves. And so they go and find Jesus. And in the midst of them talking to Jesus, they get spit at and yelled at by some Samaritans. And immediately that just triggers James and John, and they start fighting back and they start screaming. Jesus is trying to hold them back and telling them to, don't say a word. They don't listen. And after they walk away, the Samaritans, they're like, why didn't you do anything for it? They wanted to, what is the phrase they use? Burn them up with lightning.
Smite them.
Rain down.
Smite lightning.
Yeah. And so I love, after the tone calms down, Jesus, in his subtle sense of humor in the episode, is just like, you wanted me to use the power of heaven to burn these people up? And they just look at each other like, well, when you say it like that, it doesn't sound so good. Well, we do that all the time in anger, or at least I do. I mean, we call it the Franzen temper in my family. Like, when we snap, we just go crazy. And I've done way better of preventing myself because, I go to confession for it quite often and be like, did you really just tell your kid to shut up? Like, there's a nicer way to do it. Or you can still be stern and talk to people if you're upset and angry. Like, you can't control the emotion, but you can control how you respond to it. And that's what he's trying to cultivate in James and John, I think. How to first of all, realize that Jesus is there to save the Samaritans too.
Right. That's what I was going to say. So he says a line in here, how dare you think that they are not worthy, that you are more worthy than them. And this is the first time in his ministry, of course this is the beginning, where he's basically trying to explain to his chosen few that he's not really there for them. He's there for the other ones, the lost ones, more than them. But he needs them, right?
And he also explains to James and John why they were cultivating the field.
Right.
And he says it's to sow seeds for future generations.
People that you wouldn't get along with. We need to sow seeds in others.
Yeah.
The thing that really hit me with that part of the story is the like holier than thou mentality, like us versus them, like we're better because X, Y, Z. I just feel like that's something that he's really flipping on its head. Like my church is for everyone.
Right.
I agree. And there's times where maybe even us, I can't speak on behalf of everybody, but I know there's times where I've got to get that mentality out of my head. Like, man, I'm doing a good job in this area, but then there's other times where I beat myself up. So like us as Christians sometimes can, especially when any news story becomes public and you've got Christians versus everybody, like it turns into just reasons for people who don't want to be faithful to say, that's why I'm not going to be Christian. Look at how these Christians behave. But it works both ways too.
Yeah.
Like, even if one side is right, it just pointing out who's right and who's wrong usually doesn't do a good job of persuading people.
We're not the judge.
Exactly. That's why I love that story of the net where he says, just catch all the fish and I'll sort it out later.
Them out later.
You don't have to worry about all that. And I'm horrible at trying to do sorting instead of just caring for people and letting God take care of it. I'm trying to get better. You guys help me, so thank you. So after that, he nicknames them the Sons of Thunder, which we do get that in Scripture. So it's cool to see, and you'll see some of that come out of them. And they asked, is that a bad nickname? And he says, today it was.
Yeah.
But what was he says, I don't have it written down, but I know he tells them passion and enthusiasm when cultivated for righteousness is good.
Yeah.
It might have been in a different episode even. I don't know. But
It's really neat too, because at the beginning of the episode, when you see John, there's thunder in the background. And he's got like a smile on his face and he's looking out in the background. It's like he's accepted that he could convert what was once a negative nickname is now a positive. He's using that God-given passion for good.
It's also the very last thing you hear. There's thunder as they leave. So there's one more scene in there. Once again, this is a long episode, but there's a moment where Jesus is asked to read at a synagogue, and he asks John to help him pick. And this is a really cool moment. So Jesus in this discussion, does two things. One, he reminds John that he's a man.
Yeah.
But he also, when John says, and yet Jesus is like, I am who I am. And so he sort of he reveals both things to John. I'm a man, yet I'm Yahweh. Or I'm the Messiah, right?
Right.
And so that's cool. And so this is where John comes back to talking about the beginning, because they only have, 4 or 5 books to pick from, the original scrolls. And John tells Jesus he likes to start at the beginning. And in that process of Jesus reading the scripture, you see the beginning of John's gospel unfold. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you just know in that moment John's got it.
Again, well written. We don't know if that's really
correct.
If that really went down, but it would make sense. It would also make sense that Christ is foreshadowing, if he allowed John to pick the gospel, what he wants them to read, you're eventually going to write all of this down for humanity. Tell me what you want me to read. What is going to be most impactful for you as a human? John does that, which apparently, if he really chose that one, was impactful because he wrote his whole gospel chronicling or starting the same way, which I think is beautiful. I also think it's funny at the beginning when Mary is his mother now, is talking to him and kind of saying goodnight to him. She comes around the table, she kind of pats him on the shoulder, gives him a kiss on top of the head. John makes a reference to him being the loved one, the beloved one or something when he's talking. And when she says, you should ask them, and he's like, it's all right, I got it. I was the loved one or something. And then she gets up and kisses him. It's almost like she's reassuring him, you are loved. You're not going to get this wrong. Stop overthinking it. Just go with what your heart is telling you.
Absolutely. There's so much. I got to add some more notes here that I got talked about. So there's some humor in this episode I love
Lots
too.
of humor. I love it.
Yes. So one is the next morning. Well, first of all, the woman at the well, her current husband invites them to stay that night.
Yeah.
And
only
because
have 5
he's stirring up
rooms.
the crowd and he's positive, and the first time you meet this guy, he's like bitter and old and like mean to the Samaritan woman, which, do we know her name? I can't remember. I
Yeah, we
think
do.
they say it, but I don't remember it. Anyways, they invite the apostles to stay that night, and as they're entering, he says the one room might be haunted, and
But his
Jesus,
mother-in-law.
yes, and Jesus goes, "Oh, I'll take that one."
Right. Yeah.
So the next morning they wake up, and Jesus sort of has a smile on his face because he knows that Melech woke up healed,
Right.
and John asks him, why, he's laughing, and he starts talking about authority, and Jesus says, "You'll have the authority to do that once," and
Yeah.
and he also makes a joke later. Maybe I'll hold off a little bit on giving you that
Right.
authority after the Sons of Thunder moment.
But it also makes sense that John is in the room with Jesus,
Yes,
the beloved one.
Exactly.
Yeah, but there's someone else in there too. I don't know
yes,
who it is.
James.
It might be
It's
James.
James
Oh, James.
because
That's right,
the
that's
other
right.
point I was going to make is that James starts questioning Jesus. Why don't you correct all of your followers when they were wrong about something? And
Yeah.
Jesus says something great that I've told myself. Jesus says, "I don't correct all my new followers at once," or something along those lines.
I don't reveal everything at once, something
Yes.
like that.
Yeah, if all of a sudden, you're starting to open somebody's heart and they're giving God a chance to work, if you just start focusing on the things that would push them away right away,
Yeah.
if we try to do the fire and brimstone approach where, you're going to hell if you do this, this. Oh, well, I want to do that now. I want to follow
Yeah.
Jesus. No, you got to focus on love.
I feel like we see that a lot in this season. Is there's almost like a strategic pattern that Jesus has where when he's going after certain people, he knows what gets to their heart. He knows other people that could get to their heart, and that
Yeah.
comes up in later episodes. But I think that's a good example for us. We know the people that we're closest to. We know those who we want to serve and how we can serve them best. And he's giving us that example.
I agree. All right, anybody have any closing thoughts on episode 1?
I just really like how at the end when he's talking with John about what passage he should read, it was I kind of related it to, I'm not a parent, but when you put your kid in timeout, he goes to timeout, and then you immediately walk over afterwards and explain to them why they're in timeout, how they're going to move forward, what they're going to do. And it was immediately, after he was so stern with the Sons of Thunder, he immediately turned around and was like, "John, you're still worthy. You can still do what I'm calling you to do, and you still have what it takes, and I believe in you." And yeah, I just thought that was really cool.
Because John was having a moment where he didn't feel worthy.
Yeah, I feel like with us, we do something wrong, we feel guilty, and we want to turn away. But, and we see that later on with Mary too. Just run back to Jesus right away, and he
Andrew-
knows your heart.
I think there's a couple. Andrew gets bitter towards the end of this season. There's a whole bunch of these
Yeah.
guys, or guys and gals, who get lost in their own way. Or should we say ran away in their own way.
Right. We're going to have some cool moments of
Yeah.
that coming up.
And to add on to that, I feel like Jesus also knows that we're prone to make those same mistakes. You continue to see James and John having sort of Sons of Thunder moments
Yeah.
throughout the rest of this season. He knows that about us. And that forgiveness, that mercy, it's always there, even if we repeat the same mistakes over and over.
That's beautiful. All right. I I think that wraps up episode 1. Before we move on to episode 2, just one thing. It hasn't been too bad, but one thing I noticed when I was having to edit, and that's why your phones aren't out and making noise, but mine was vibrating on the table, so a lot of times when we're pounding the table and stuff, I can hear that, and I have to try to edit it out because it's hard to hear the voice.
Yeah, Abby.
It hasn't been bad today. The only thing that reminded me when she was like, bam, it wasn't bad. So
That was just thunder.
yeah, don't worry.
Phone's on
Don't
silent.
overthink it, but sometimes we do hear some of that. It's fine. Thank you for listening to this episode of the BBHS Seek and Find podcast. If you like what you heard, please like and share with a friend. Be sure to subscribe to all of our social media. You can follow us on Instagram and YouTube at BBHS.SeekandFind. You can also follow us on Facebook at Bishop Russer High School Seek and Find Ministry. Once again, thanks for listening, and may God bless you today.